In 2019, Louisiana unleashed 80,000 hungry alligators into a dead, fishless swamp nearly the size of Miami, against every expert warning, in a desperate attempt to revive an ecosystem everyone else had written off. Critics called it ecological suicide, a multi-million-dollar disaster in the making. So why did this top-down gamble defy science, spark outrage, and transform a poisoned graveyard into something that stunned the world? To understand, we have to go back to the day the Atchafalaya Basin died. Before the collapse, the Atchafalaya Basin was a living maze of cypress, tupelo, and open water, home to more than 300 species of birds, dozens of fish, and a way of life rooted in the rhythms of the swamp. Fishermen pulled up nets heavy with catfish and crawfish. Children learned to paddle pirogues before they could drive. For generations, the basin fed local families and fueled a regional economy built on what the wetlands provided. Everything changed in the 1960s. Upstream, industrial farms and chemical plants ramped up fertilizer and pesticide use. Rain carried these chemicals down the Mississippi and into the basin, where they pooled in backwaters and low-lying sloughs. The water turned green, then thick, as toxic algae blooms exploded. Algae sucked the oxygen from the water, leaving fish gasping at the surface before sinking out of sight. By the late 1970s, survey teams recorded stretches of water with oxygen levels too low to support even the hardiest species. The collapse was relentless. Fish disappeared first, then turtles, then amphibians. What remained was a silent marsh choked with mats of dead vegetation. The once rich food web unraveled, leaving behind little more than stagnant water and the ghosts of lost abundance. Local families watched as their children left for jobs in Baton Rouge or Lafayette, the old ways slipping away with each empty net. By the 1980s, nearly 47,000 acres of the basin had become what scientists called a hypoxic dead zone. The Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries mapped these areas in dull gray. No fish, no commercial harvests, no value except as a line item in the state's maintenance budget. Attempts to revive the basin ran into political gridlock. Cleaning up the water would cost hundreds of millions, a price tag far beyond what any agency could justify for a place most had already given up on. For the people who once depended on the basin, the loss was more than economic. It was cultural, generational, a break in the chain that connected families to the land and water. The swamp became a cautionary tale, a reminder of what unchecked pollution and neglect could erase. In the end, the Atchafalaya did not die in a single disaster. It faded, acre by acre, until only memory and maps marked what had been lost. State budgets for wetland restoration had been stretched thin for decades. Every proposal to revive the Atchafalaya's dead waters came with a price tag that made even the most optimistic officials wince. Cleaning up the poisoned sediment, replanting native vegetation, and restocking fish would have cost $340 million, spread over 40 years, with no guarantee of success. The basin, once a source of pride, now looked like a bottomless pit for public funds. In early 2019, the Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries faced a stark reality. The money was gone, and the problem remained. Maintenance alone drained resources, and the basin's decline was accelerating. Traditional restoration had failed to deliver results, and patience was wearing thin. Against this backdrop, a single proposal landed on the commissioner's desks, a plan so unconventional it bordered on reckless. Dr. James Thornton, a restoration ecologist with deep roots in Gulf Coast wetlands, stepped forward with a theory that challenged the entire restoration playbook. Thornton argued that alligators, long treated as a byproduct of healthy wetlands, could be used as tools to engineer recovery from the top down. He pointed to research from the Everglades and Louisiana's own marshes, describing how alligators dig and maintain water-filled depressions called alligator holes that create pockets of habitat even in the harshest droughts. If enough alligators were released into the Atchafalaya's dead zone, he reasoned, their digging, movement, and waste could physically reshape the land, potentially jump-starting the food web from scratch. The plan called for relocating 80,000 alligators from overpopulated areas, an unprecedented scale, but well within the state's capacity given its experience managing millions of farm-raised and wild gators since the 1970s. Alligators could be engineers of recovery. The commission weighed the risks. Critics warned of mass starvation, cannibalism, and the possibility that desperate predators would wander into nearby communities. Environmental groups called the idea ecological roulette, but the cost comparison was impossible to ignore. $12.3 million for the alligator experiment, including capture, transport, and 3 years of monitoring, was less than 5% of what traditional restoration demanded. For some, the gamble was a last resort. For others, it was a chance to try something bold before writing off the basin completely. In February 2019, after heated debate and a close vote, the commission approved the pilot. Planning moved fast. By March 2019, teams of wildlife officers, biologists, and contractors began rounding up alligators from across the state. Over several weeks, convoys of trucks and airboats ferried the animals to 127 drop points, scattered across the 47,000-acre dead zone. Each gator was measured, tagged, and released into water that held no fish, no turtles, and no promise of survival. The official line was cautious optimism, but privately, many involved expected little more than a slow-motion disaster. Still, with little left to lose, Louisiana placed its BET not on technology, but on the raw instincts of an ancient predator. Within weeks of the release, the Atchafalaya Basin became a scene of grim confirmation for the project's harshest critics. Wildlife officers on morning patrols counted dozens of alligator carcasses drifting in stagnant water, their bodies thin, jaws agape. The first official mortality logs, compiled in late April, recorded an 18% die-off among the relocated population. In some sectors, the losses were even higher. Biologists noted deep bite wounds on smaller gators, evidence of cannibalism, larger individuals turning on the weak as food vanished. The news traveled fast. Local newspapers ran front-page stories showing aerial shots of lifeless marsh, dotted with dead alligators. National outlets picked up the story, framing it as another failed government experiment. Environmental groups demanded an immediate halt, calling the project reckless and inhumane. Statements from national non-governmental organizations accused the state of ecological malpractice, warning that the experiment would only hasten the basin's collapse. Their open letters to the governor cited the mortality logs and included graphic images from field cameras, alligators fighting over empty territory, scavenging the remains of their own kind. Marine biologists weighed in, pointing to established models that predicted exactly this outcome. With no fish, no amphibians, and only the occasional insect hatch, the food web simply could not support so many top predators. In interviews, researchers described the basin as a biological desert, a place where even scavengers would soon run out of options. Some predicted that within months the survivors would either starve or begin to disperse into neighboring wetlands, searching for food and risking conflict with nearby communities. At the Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries, the mood shifted from anxious hope to defensive urgency. Agency spokespeople fielded calls from reporters and legislators, insisting that the mortality rate, while high, had been anticipated. But leaked emails revealed mounting concern among staff. Internal memos debated whether to intervene or let the experiment play out. Some staff argued that pulling the plug now would be an admission of failure. Others warned that public outrage could force a shutdown before any positive effects could be measured. For the moment, the project hung in the balance. The basin's silence, once a sign of ecological collapse, now echoed with the sound of a gamble gone wrong. No one could say what would happen next, but the evidence, dead alligators, empty water, and a chorus of angry headlines pointed to only one conclusion. The experiment was failing, and fast. By the 5th month, the basin was no longer just a graveyard for alligators. The first hints came from field mapping teams sent in to document what, if anything, was left to salvage. Instead of the expected clusters of carcasses, researchers found themselves charting a landscape that was changing beneath their boots. In sector after sector, GPS units traced the outlines of new depressions, some as small as a backyard pool, others stretching wider than a basketball court. Surveyors logged more than 3,000 distinct pools scattered across the dead zone, each one freshly excavated, ringed by mounded mud and torn-up mats of old vegetation. The digging was not random. Aerial images revealed patterns, lines, and clusters where groups of alligators had worked the same patch of muck, sometimes side by side. Biologists who had spent years studying solitary gator holes in the Everglades were stunned by the scale. Instead of isolated depressions, here was a patchwork of interconnected pools, some over 200 feet across, stitched together by narrow channels. The ground itself looked as if it had been plowed by earth-moving machines, but the only engines were muscle and instinct. Water samples collected from the deepest excavations told a story no one had predicted. The alligators had churned through decades of compacted, toxic sediment, breaking through to older layers that held cleaner groundwater. Where the pools reached these ancient aquifers, the water was noticeably clearer. Chemical analyses showed dissolved oxygen levels in these pools had jumped, sometimes measuring more than 3 times higher than the surrounding stagnant marsh. Monitoring teams recorded readings up to 340% above baseline, a spike that, for the first time in decades, crossed the threshold needed for aquatic life to survive. Field notes from that summer are filled with disbelief. One technician wrote that it's like they are building the place from scratch. Another wrote that they expected bodies, not construction sites. The project, once dismissed as a slow-motion disaster, was suddenly being re-examined as a massive ecosystem engineering event. The alligators were not just clinging to life. They were physically reshaping the basin, turning dead water into a mosaic of new habitats. For the first time since the collapse, the possibility of recovery, however unlikely, felt real enough to measure. Field ecologists returning to the Atchafalaya Basin in late summer 2019 described a landscape that seemed to breathe again. In the excavated pools, water once stained with decay now shimmered with movement. The first signs came from below the surface. Mosquito larvae and tiny mayfly nymphs darted through the water, their eggs having waited years beneath layers of silt for just this moment. Dragonfly larvae followed, their armored bodies clinging to the mud walls of fresh depressions. The pools, carved by alligator muscle and persistence, became living islands in a sea of stagnation. Wading birds, absent for a generation, began to appear in small flocks. Herons and egrets stalked the pool margins, picking off insects and invertebrates that had multiplied in the new oxygen-rich water. For the first time in 30 years, bird counts recorded their return to the basin. Ornithologists noted how these birds, drawn by the sudden abundance, brought something else with them: nutrients. Each bird's droppings added nitrogen and phosphorus, fertilizing the water and feeding a bloom of microscopic phytoplankton. This invisible pulse of life at the base of the food web set off a chain reaction, with zooplankton and larger aquatic invertebrates following close behind. Around the pools, a subtle transformation took root. Seeds long buried in the sediment responded to the improved water and light. Shoots of cattail, water lily, and marsh grass began to push through the mud. By the end of the first growing season, dense stands of green rimmed more than half the new pools. Botanists traced this rebound to the basin's seed bank, dormant plant life waiting for a break in the cycle of decay. The new vegetation stabilized the mud, filtered runoff, and created shade for amphibians. Frogs, missing for decades, returned to breed in the shallow edges. Their calls joined the chorus of insects, filling the air with sound that had been absent for so long. In the space of a year, the basin's food web was knitting itself together, one pool at a time. By 2025, the Achaphalea's transformation could be measured in hard numbers, not just hopeful anecdotes. Wildlife surveys recorded a stabilized population of around 68,000 alligators across the project area, down from the initial release, but now holding steady year to year. The most dramatic change was visible from above. Remote sensing teams using satellite imagery documented that 31,000 acres of the original 47,000 acre dead zone now supported dense, functioning wetland habitat. Vegetation coverage had surged by more than 500% compared to the baseline in 2019, with new growth spreading in wide bands around the excavated pools and along newly formed channels. The price tag for the entire experiment, from first capture to final monitoring flight, landed at $15.8 million. In the world of restoration, where projects often stretch into the hundreds of millions, with no guarantee of success, this was a fraction of what traditional methods would have cost. The numbers forced a reckoning. For less than 5% of the projected cost of chemical and mechanical restoration, Louisiana had revived 2/3 of a landscape that had been written off for decades. The results drew attention far beyond the basin's muddy banks. Policy analysts in Florida and Texas launched studies to see if the method could be adapted for their own degraded wetlands. In Tallahassee, a task force began modeling a similar approach for 12,000 acres of Everglades marsh. Conservation agencies from as far away as Brazil and China requested data on the project's outcomes and cost structure. For the first time, the idea that apex predators could drive ecosystem recovery was not just a theory, it was a line item in restoration budgets and a subject of international workshops. What started as a desperate gamble had become a case study in ecological engineering, shifting the conversation about how wetlands can be revived when conventional strategies fall short. The evidence was undeniable. Population counts, acreage gains, and a financial ledger made even the skeptics take notice. Right now, real wetlands across America are vanishing at a rate of 80,000 acres each year. As climate extremes and pollution accelerate, restoration demands new thinking, sometimes even the impossible. The lesson: nature's top predators can transform dead zones in ways science is only starting to understand. The future of our wildest places may depend on daring to try what no one expects. What risks would you take to revive a lost world?